Welcome to my third guide on the dimensional hole rune dungeons. Today we're going to talk about the most recent release dimension, Lumel. And straight up, I gotta tell you guys that Lumel is actually much easier than I thought it was when I first looked at the boss fight and through various guides on YouTube I've seen so far. But let's discuss that later on. I would also not be a good content creator if I didn't also mention my other two guides that I've recorded so far. So if you're a rather early game, you might also want to check out the Karzhan guide.
Oh, fuck yeah, this is the shit! Kill me now!
Or if you'd consider yourself to be more of a fairy type person, there are also a couple of guides that I've made on that one. In addition, there is plenty of other videos that are less suitable for YouTube as a platform. Yeah, I've actually just mentioned fairy porn in a guide on a Korean Pokemon game. I've reached the peak of my career. In today's guide, we're going to talk about why you should be farming Lumel, when you should be considering farming another dimension. We're going to have a little bit of a boss fight discussion, talking about every single stage and just the basic concept of the boss fight itself. After that, we're going to move over to the team building. We're going to talk about which sort of elements you need to incorporate in your team and give you guys a vague tier list, which is actually the first time that I want to include this in one of my guides. And at the end, I want to have a little bit of a rune discussion, just kind of giving you guys the basic principles of how to rune your units for this dimension. So when I first started the testing for the Lumel dimension, I've looked through YouTube, and while there were some guides, they all seemed either completely outdated, spur of the moment clickbait, or had insane rune requirements. One of the first that I looked into when it comes to like B5 for Lumel. Now, this guy is basically using a free-to-play team, and I personally am not able to replicate his rune builds. Not a good start for the dimension, not gonna lie. This really put me off, and I didn't even want to bother. But after the first couple of test runs and your guys' feedback on my last live stream, I got a lot more optimistic about it. I'm so happy, we found a 100% team. This is freaking awesome, guys. So I guess at this point, I just want to, again, quickly thank all of you guys for showing up. These streams are truly helping me out with my research, and you should like totally subscribe with notifications to never miss one of my next uploads. I seriously love you guys. So the bottom line is gonna be, if you're a beginner, go for Karzhan, but unlike I expected, Lumel is much easier and a lot more free-to-play friendly than Illunia. So if you're up for the challenge, this guide is just for you. I've always included this segment just in case. The bottom line is, I believe you should be spending some time in every one of the dimensions, no matter what. But comparing Lumel to Illunia, they both kind of share the most important rune set. Will.
Yeah.
So by deciding between either one of those two, you're already basically being 70% more efficient with the progression compared to all of those people building additional secondary awakened toys. I mean, just look at these babies that I've pulled just in that 1 week worth of farming Lumel while editing this guide. With that said, the bottom line is going to be, are you more of an RTA player? Go for Illunia. The recent Violent nerf did give Despair a bump up in efficiency.
Say about his power level. It's over 9,000!
But don't underestimate the power of destroy runes in guild content, so just choose wisely. So now that we've covered the basics in the decision making for this dungeon, I'd like to talk about the boss fight mechanics. And first of all, the Lumel dimension has a star restriction of 20, which means that you won't be able to stack net 5s. Second of all, the primary element in your team should be water due to the boss being fire. It's not really such a big deal to bring different elements since the boss is never gonna glance on you due to one of his passives, which also gives him a ton of crit rate and crit damage on top of that. His second passive adds some additional damage for each turn the boss takes, and also increases the boss's attack speed for every hit that you land on either the boss itself or one of his allies. So those two passives basically ensure that trying to tank this boss fight is virtually impossible, so don't even try. Outside of those two passives, we will have to deal with two abilities. The first one is going to apply continuous damage, and we'll also go through death restriction, which again, that means that running Garrow, running Triana, etc. doesn't really work out too well. Second ability changes according to each stage of the boss fight. I think so far every single dimension had at least one phase in the boss fight that is just kind of meant to annoy you, that is pretty much completely harmless, but it is going to take at least 2 minutes out of your day if you do not pay attention. Well, I think stage 1 in the Lumel dimension is definitely that. They didn't even bother giving that boss an additional ability, but just added a passive that gives the boss and his allies additional sustain. Well, don't get me wrong, you might still die. Like the fire werewolf, it does hit pretty hard if you don't focus him down. And while you're at it, might as well also go for Armon. The boss doesn't really hit too hard anyways, as long as you kill him in a decent amount of time, so just keep at it. I think the too long didn't read for this boss fight in particular. It's just, this is the reason why people stack heal break in their team comps, but I think I will be talking about that in the next segment when it comes to team building later on. But for now, let's just continue with phase number 2. Now, here is where the fight actually gets a lot more intense. The boss special ability hits for continuous damage, and also on top of that reduces attack bar. And if that wasn't enough, he is going to get additional damage. The more continuous damage is already on your team, I think you're going to have a pretty bad time. So you do want to focus the martial cat first, and maybe also potentially kill the salamander warrior next, just to be safe. So what we can take away from this one is that this is the reason why people are stacking things like resistance, they're stacking immunity, and also add additional cleansers in their team. What makes this stage even more intense is the fact that there is a lot of spread out damage on your entire team, but also still a lot of single target damage as well. So if you're looking for a consistent team, this will most likely be your biggest challenge to overcome. So for me personally, this phase is responsible for about 80% of my own wipes. The spare ability of the boss, it just hits like a truck, and it does also go through immunity and cannot be resisted if the boss crits, which for the first couple of throws will be always the case pretty much. Don't forget, like, the boss gets extra crit rate for every one of his allies being alive, and honestly I do think that the allies are the least scary thing in this fight. I mean, they do provide some extra threat in the form of armor break and also the AoE silence, but god damn it, that spare ability, it's kind of just the reason why people are stacking that many attack breaks. They're running a lot of violent sets and also anti-crit. And I do think that this is a pretty good segue into the next segment of today's video. I want to talk about team building. Yeah, I know, that boss fight, it got extremely overwhelming with all of the different playstyles that you need to incorporate and also rune for. Just imagine, like, I got up today in the morning and I thought about building like a Colleen, Fran, Darian, Theomars team. And like 2 hours into testing and all of your guys' ideas and advice, Jesus fucking Christ, man, this shit is actually working out. Like, we literally turned around the meta so far. This testing is freaking awesome. I loved it. And I think, as always, we're gonna first take a look at the monster discussion segment, just to kind of get a rough idea of what is going to be good. But like the last I mentioned, there's always 1 or 2 Fighter 1 logic picks that make sense on paper, but that I would kind of avoid when actually trying to build your first Lumel Dimension team. So for instance, I've already mentioned the heal block of the first stage of the boss fight, and there are a lot of units that get picked specifically for that reason, completely forgetting about how it's mostly just going to slow you down, but really doesn't have a very big impact on your success rate. So unless you're a fan of reviving every second run, I think monsters like Joltan should be kind of avoided. Susano is for the solo potential and Joltan is for the armor break and the heal break. And the dots do come in handy. The boss fight has a lot of AoEs, so Joltan is like a slightly above average pick. But all in all, I would probably trade him for a Vigor 9 out of 10 times. But we're gonna give that a try. It's not a 100% team, is it? Like, I would need a violent Aegir for this to be 100%, but even then, like, my front is just gonna die. Nice. Yeah, this is not a viable team. You guys need to realize is that I'm not testing for, like, what I'm testing for is not like what you could potentially do if you had insane runes. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find teams that people can actually replicate. And this shit is not working. In contrast to the kind of neglectable heal block mechanics, I think the most important thing that you need to incorporate in your team is going to be anti-crit. It is going to be one of the things that is going to allow you to deal with the burst damage in the boss fight. Second round of his AoE. Let's see how much damage this is going to do. Dude, the anti-crit is so good. So for that reason, people started picking units like the Water Werewolf, who kind of combines armor break, heal block, and anti-crit in his entire kit, which I think he takes the top spot for this dimension. I actually never really built him myself. I decided to see if I can find some alternatives during one of my testing streams, and I actually ended up picking the Light Drunken Master instead. If you're a beginner and you're just starting building units and stuff, I think Vigor is like pretty solid. But if you're endgame, like, I don't want to fucking spend another 120 dimension hole energy for a side grade, right? So from my experience, incorporating anti-crit catapulted my own success rate from 80% to about 100 without even like trying too hard. But in case you're still not sold on the anti-crit buff, there are some other options that you can still go for, such as stacking attack break and also violent sets on those units, just to ensure to get extra chances to actually apply that debuff. Or another option would be just clearing the first 2 stages and then running a lot of bruisers with vamp sets or revives such as Perna. Sig is like, it's an upgrade to Theomars, so it's better than Theomars because of the attack break and the better leader skill. It has like a way better leader skill. So I think Sig, out of all of the net 5s that you can have, is most likely going to be like one of the only ones that you want to use. Oh yeah, Perna. Perna is like by far the strongest for this dungeon, just because of the revive mechanic that he brings, and also the additional sustain, the better leader skill, very low stat requirements, HP based scaling. The boss has a lot of HP obviously, but Sig is like somewhere in that tier list. The main reason why I think Sig is like problematic is because of the second stage having a lot of burst, like it has a lot of AoE, and the Wind Martial Cat is gonna like go to town on this guy. So you're gonna have to run a very bruiserish build, which is gonna make him less useful for other things, but at the same time, I've been recommending a bruiser Sigmarus for a very long time. Like TUA hard Sigmarus is something like speed crit damage HP, which I think is also gonna be the correct way to run him in this dungeon. And the attack break is pretty good. On that note, I think Perna always seemed to be one of the best picks for this dungeon on paper. At least that's what it was before I actually looked at the mechanics of the boss fight. And while I do still think that Perna is definitely amongst the top 3 units to pick for this dungeon, I do not really think that he is the gatekeeper that people make him out to be. And I think the last thing that I want to talk about is going to be cleanses and immunity. And compared to all of the other things that I discussed so far, you got a lot more options. But also I kind of do have a very hard time recommending anything other than Fran, maybe in combination with the Veramos. If you're completely free to play, you can also combine a Fran with units like a Miyang. It just kind of has to incorporate a little bit more offensive things as well. Like basically Wusa and Veladrol, if they were net 3s, like the reason why Veladrol and Wusa are so much worse is because they have higher stats, like higher stars, compared to units like a Fran, and don't really do much more. Now they have better base stats, but if Fran is so much more better, and they don't, like, you can't stack them. So there is no player in the game that should put a Wusa in their team over a Fran. There is no player in the game that should put a Veladrol over a Fran. And since Fran is free to play, there's just no question. The reason why I don't like Tetra, I actually built Tetra specifically for that reason. Like I built the Tetra specifically to work in Lumel, and I tried it out. The bottom line is Tetra is actually too defensive. It's like a Rakuni, where Tetra is really good against boss fights where there's not a lot of burst damage. And this boss fight, like this dungeon, is just burst damage. So the cleanse and stuff, it's working and it's good and all, but the boss is just gonna one-shot you either way. And if you don't have mechanics to counter that, you're like a lot more fucked than with the debuffs. The debuffs are painful. Now, Beta is anti-crit, which is one of the most important debuffs for this, I'd say. Yeah, I would probably put her somewhere there or there. Somewhere like that. because the revive is kind of shit. The boss has a lot of AoE damage, which single target revive is kind of bad. Immunity compared to Fran is like, I think Fran is still most likely better. Like, I'd say the combo with Fran and Vigor is much better than Beta plus anything else, I'd say. Or I'm gonna have a very hard time finding a reason to pick. I think she's most likely up there, actually. Just make sure that it's not just immunity, but also bring something a little bit more offensive than that, like a Beta or an Anavol should work as well. I think I'm just gonna leave my tier list on the screen right now. The bottom line is just the main criteria that I use for this one is gonna be that the units need to provide some sort of utility for your team. I also do take into consideration what their rune requirements are, and I try and contrast it with the star requirements. So units that have lower star total, they do get higher rankings if they do the same thing as their net 5 counterparts. So just again, as an example, this is the reason why units like Fran get so much higher rankings than units like Wusa. I know, it's kind of annoying that I constantly have to re-explain all of these things whenever I do one of my tier lists, but resource management doesn't seem to be the strength of all of my subscribers, lol. So now with all of that said, let's talk about the room builds, and as you guys can already tell from the team building discussion, there is a huge plethora of units that you can choose from. Because of that reason, I just decided to talk about the units that most of you guys will be incorporating in your team comps, and then just kind of like going more and more into detail with certain niche picks that I personally tried out. But if there's one unit that pretty much everyone is going to be running, it's going to be Fran as your main immunity unit, cleanser, and also healer. Now, one of the biggest differentiations between runing a Fran for the dimensional hole Lumel and a regular Fran is going to be the will offset. Now, especially with the recent update allowing us to swap between RTA and our regular room builds, I think the will offset for Fran kind of got a little bit outdated. So if there is an offset that I would recommend, it will most likely be something like either Nemesis, Endure, or maybe just run an energy offset just to make sure that you get additional stats or utility from that. The violence set, on the other hand, I think is a must. Now, the stats that you see on my Fran actually are a little bit too good for this dimension, but the bottom line is going to be that you want to have speed slot 2, HP slots 4, and on slot 6 the same. I think you should be aiming for about plus 15k HP on your Fran in total. You really shouldn't care too much about the attack, especially since most teams do have more than one healer anyways. I personally up my success rate even more by using a Veramos lead as my secondary cleanser / off healer as well. That Veramos lead kind of just ensures that I'm definitely at 100% success rate. I've done about 300 runs on the Lumel dimension and haven't failed a single one with the team that you guys saw me utilize in the background. So again, I would highly recommend it, even if you have units like a Wusa or whatever. But this is basically how I personally rune my Fran. Now, continuing forward from that, let's talk about my anti-crit buffer, Tian Qian. And for him, he's runed a lot different than Vigor. I think Vigor is a lot easier to rune since he does have HP scaling and also his water as an element. But for Tian Qian, it's an attack-based healer, which doesn't really help out too much for this dimension. You actually want to be a little bit more tanky than do damage. But basically, I choose to go for Fatal Offset. And the distribution is going to be speed slot 2, attack slot 4, and defense slot 6. Now, pretty much the way I go for mine is about 20k HP. Pretty much those are the stats that I run on my Tian Qian. Again, I think he's a little bit more of a late game unit. Compare that to Vigor, which again, I personally haven't built that. So let's just pull up Asher just for you guys to have like somewhat similar base stats. I think Vigor actually has a little bit more base speed anyways, so because of that reason, I would highly recommend going for a Swift offset, maybe a Violent if you can actually pull that off. I don't know how many Violent sets you guys have, but pretty much the stat distribution that I would go for is going to be speed slot 2, crit damage slot 4, and HP slot 6. I think that should be probably the best build for you. Like, you're going to have him tanky either way. And on that note, one thing that you guys see me do a lot on my units is I try and stack accuracy. Now, this isn't really something that I do on my Tian Qian, but my Fran actually has 40%. Now, the accuracy cap that you should be aiming for on your attack breakers is going to be something along the lines of 45%, just to ensure that you get additional success rate just from that and that you do not get resisted. Now, the next unit that I want to talk about quickly is going to be your armor breakers. Now, compared to all of the other dimensions, for Lumel, you got a lot of different options. And I think I want to start off by talking about Jultan. Even though I personally do not utilize him myself, I know that there's a lot of people that actually like him. Now, keep in mind that my Jultan is kind of ruined as a hybrid. I utilize him in Siege and Guild War, but if you were to rune your Jultan, for Lumel in particular, I would highly recommend going for a triple revenge build, maybe violent revenge if you have those runes. And in terms of the stat distribution, just go for triple HP builds. You should be good to go like that. The speed really shouldn't matter too much. You could technically also run a Swift set, just judging from that base speed. But all in all, I think Jultan is like by far the easiest to rune unit. Like compare that to a Darien who has slightly worse base stats. But overall, in my opinion, like the way I love using Darien on my own teams. I do get that additional tank ability from his passive just to ensure that, again, my Fran doesn't die too soon. And I really do not care too much about that heal break. Now, again, like I already talked about, in my Karzhan dimension, I pretty much haven't changed Darien's room builds. I have him on a hybrid build. Use him in R5 and also in this dimension. So because of that reason, I go for defense, HP, and defense. Now, if you were to specifically rune a Darien for this dimension, I would rather have you guys go for a double HP and 1 defense build over a double defense and 1 HP build, just to get some extra HP. You will fight a lot of armor breakers in these sort of dimensions, and getting those extra HP stats is going to ensure that you're not going to just fall over when you get armor break. I could be talking about Beladion, but I personally really do not think that he's that amazing in this dimension in particular, so I'm actually going to leave him out. But just for reference, he's on Violent Nemesis. The room build hasn't really changed compared to Karzhan. But like I said, I really do not think that Beladion is that amazing of a pick for this dimension, so I'm just going to like quickly glance over him, honestly. The last armor breaker that I want to talk about is going to be Theomars for now. Now, Theomars is insanely hard to run for this dimension. You are going to run him with a crit lead most likely, which enables you to focus a little bit less on the crit rate on pretty much not even people like me are able to actually pull a really well-runed Theomars off. I think it's kind of lackluster overall. It's sort of like Fighter 1 logic, basically just like a damage dealer, but he really doesn't provide enough utility in my opinion to actually justify a spot if you actually build teams specifically for this dimension. But he is a good unit to start off when you don't want to like completely rearrange your room box just for this dimension. So because of that reason, my Theomars is on Violent Revenge, speed, crit damage, and HP percentage. But like I said, mine actually doesn't even cut the stat requirements for this dungeon. He doesn't do enough damage to justify a slot. And if a player that has been playing this game for like 5.5 years can't pull off the stats, chances are most of you casuals won't be able to either. Now let me just finish off this rune showcase by just quickly going over my Veramos' runes. Now Veramos is pretty easy to rune for this dimension. I actually have mine again on somewhat of a bruiser build, so because of that reason he's on double destroy nemesis. I use him in Guild War as well, so because of that reason that's kind of like the way I go for him. But he's on speed, HP, and attack percentage. If you want to rune a Veramos specifically for this dungeon, I mean, as you guys saw, he did work out like this either way. But if you actually want to optimize this rune build, I would highly suggest going for something like a speed, crit damage, HP builds. The violent offset isn't really that mandatory. I would much rather have you guys go for maybe for a nemesis build. I think actually a double nemesis build would most likely be the best option, just to ensure that you do get that cleanse off when the boss uses his spear in the third phase of the boss fight. Pretty much like all of my other units, I go for about 20k HP. If I combine that with the Darien passive, that's good enough for me to actually survive the boss fight and get to 100% success rate. And yeah, I think that's pretty much going to be all of the units that I want to talk about in today's rune showcase. Like I said, the options that you got are pretty huge. So if you guys got some specific questions how to rune certain units, just leave a question in the comment section. I will be happily answering them. Even though I personally do not own all of the units that I discussed in today's guide, I do have a rough understanding how to actually rune them from my 5.5 years playing this game. Wow, so after all of those things, I think we finally made it to the end of today's guide. Sorry for taking so long to edit these, But it is kind of a pain to actually sift through all of my streams and write a coherent script. But reading through your guys' comments of my Karzhan guide definitely kept me motivated. As always, let me know what you guys think about this guide in the comment section. Are there any aspects that I forgot to talk about? Do you agree with the stuff that I discussed in today's video? I do also know that there were some people complaining about the audio of my memes, so I tried to not blast any headphone users in today's guide, and on top of that I did also try and slow down my speech by a little bit. But with all of that said, I think that's gonna be it for today's guide. It's already like long enough as it is right there. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to leave a like, and until then, see you guys in the next video. Bye!